Welcome to the Dream Novel channel. Before starting to listen to the fun in this clip, don't forget to like and comment, so that the admin will have the encouragement to continue making clips. Let's go listen. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 211, The suitcase is still too small. After Hagrid left with Fawn, Kyle turned to the three of them with a grin. So, the egg's in the fireplace. How long were you planning on keeping it hidden? Oh, come on. Ron groaned. Hermione, didn't you say you read that book before? How come you didn't know a dragon egg would give off a smell when it's in the fire? Or did you misread the title? Shut up. Do you really think I'd miss something like that? I'm not you. Hermione snapped. Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them is a required school book. Of course I read it, and not just once. Then how come? Don't ask me, I don't know. Hermione said, scratching her head. I don't remember anything about a smell. The book only talks about how to hatch dragon eggs. As they spoke, all three turned to Kyle. Ron looked at him suspiciously. You're not making this up, are you? He still trusted Hermione's memory more than Kyle's. Hermione had never been wrong when reciting from a textbook. What about Fawn? Kyle replied. Do you think he'd fake it for me? Harry thought for a moment. Maybe, he just wasn't feeling well. Kyle raised an eyebrow. Pretty convenient timing if that's the case. He took a sip of tea from the table, then looked over at Hermione. I'd guess you bought your copy of the book before the start of term. Yes, I picked it up the first time I went to Diagon Alley, Hermione said, frowning. Why? Kyle spread his hands. Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them has actually gone through several revisions. I think the person at Flourish and Blots gave you an older edition. As he spoke, he pulled out his own copy of the book and handed it to Hermione. Take a look for yourself. Hermione took the book and quickly flipped to the section on dragons. Sure enough, just as Kyle had said, the note about the smell was right there. When she checked the publication date, she realized the two editions were more than 50 years apart. This is outrageous. Hermione said indignantly. That's practically fraud. How could they do this? It's actually pretty normal, Kyle explained. Newt's revised it so many times over the years, but they've kept the cover design the same. Unless you open it up, it's hard to tell which version you have. Plus, the store was packed before term started, so the assistant probably didn't notice they'd handed you an old copy. Hermione recalled her trip to Flourish and Blots. All the Hogwarts textbooks had been placed near the entrance, but the area where Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them was supposed to be had been picked clean. The assistants had been swamped, and she'd ended up rummaging around in a back corner to find her copy. Oh, for goodness sake. Now Hermione was mad at herself. Kyle's book was packed with more detailed information, and if she'd known, she would have held out a little longer to find the latest edition. If it really bothers you, you could always take it back to Flourish and Blots during the holiday and swap it out. I bet they'd be fine with that, Kyle suggested with a smile. 50 years ago had been Newt's peak writing period, and new revisions were sometimes released just days apart. Back then, old editions were quickly phased out, so they didn't circulate much anymore. Now, most bookstores kept an entire set of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them as a badge of prestige, even if the older versions weren't useful to most readers. No, it's fine. Hermione handed the book back to Kyle. It wasn't that expensive, anyway. I'll just buy a new one next time. With that, she sat back down on a nearby stool. It was far too warm by the fireplace, and since Kyle had already discovered the dragon egg, there was no reason to keep sweating by the fire. Harry and Ron followed suit. Now that nothing was blocking his view, Kyle spotted the large, dark egg stashed beneath the kettle. A Norwegian Ridgeback. That's right, said Hagrid, who had just re-entered. He shut the door behind him, practically vibrating with excitement. What do you think? Pretty rare, isn't it? Kyle nodded. The Norwegian Ridgeback was one of the rarest breeds, just behind the Hungarian Horntail and the Antipodean Opali. On the way to find the rowan trees, Hagrid kept glancing anxiously back toward his cabin. "You can go back and take care of the dragon egg. I know the way, so there's really no need for you to come along," Kyle suggested. But Hagrid shook his head firmly. "No, I can't let you go into the Forbidden Forest alone." "All right," Kyle sighed, sounding a bit disappointed. "I'll just try to pick the quickest route then." After a pause, he added, "But by the way, how did you even manage to get hold of a dragon egg?" "Didn't buy it, I won it," Hagrid replied with a hint of pride. "Was pure luck, really. The other day, one of the lads I drink with told me someone down in the village had a dragon egg and was using it in a game of cards. Asked if I'd be interested. So you went to Hogsmeade?" "I wasn't keen on going, what with the Forbidden Forest actin' up lately. But it was a dragon egg." Hagrid lowered his voice and added excitedly, "The guy was clueless. I tricked him easy with a bit of a bluff." Kyle raised an eyebrow at the grinning Hagrid, staying silent. For someone to be outwitted by Hagrid, well, that said a lot about the person's intelligence. "But what's your plan once it hatches?" Kyle asked. "Oh, I've been reading up," Hagrid said, though his gaze drifted once more toward his hut. "When it hatches, you just feed it a bucket of chicken blood mixed with brandy every half hour." "Be careful," Kyle advised. "Norwegian Ridgebacks are far from quiet. They're just as aggressive as Hungarian Horntails, so it's not exactly easy to keep one under wraps." "Well, yeah, I'll be careful," Hagrid replied, a bit evasively. The excitement of soon raising a dragon seemed to overshadow any concerns he might have had. "In that case," Kyle said, patting Hagrid's arm, "if you ever need help, just ask. Don't hesitate. Dragons grow quickly, and within a month, the Ridgeback would be larger than Fluffy." Kyle figured he'd need to expand the suitcase as soon as he got back. The two eventually arrived near the Mooncalves' habitat, where the rowan trees thrived best. Kyle walked over and began carefully examining the trunks of the rowan trees, while Hagrid stood guard, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. He couldn't stop worrying about the dragon egg back in his cabin. One moment, he fretted about whether the fire in the hearth would go out, the next, he worried that Harry and the others might accidentally crack the egg. His anxiety grew, and he kept glancing back, looking as though he'd rather head straight back to his hut. Meanwhile, Kyle scoped out the area and quickly identified two young, less dense rowan trees. They would be ideal for transplanting, as they'd be much easier to move and far more likely to survive. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 212, Ron's Illusion. After committing the location of the two rowan trees to memory, Kyle didn't linger. He returned to Hagrid, who was standing nearby, awkwardly holding a bundle of branches he'd picked up, all while casting glances back at his cabin. "Oh, you picked them out that quickly?" Hagrid stammered, turning to face Kyle. "I wasn't thinking about the dragon egg, honest. Just saw something running over there a moment ago, might have been a Kneasel." "There are still Kneasels in the Forbidden Forest?" "Oh, yeah." Relieved that Kyle seemed to believe him, Hagrid continued, "Actually, there's quite a few Kneasels in the forest, but they don't usually come out in front of wizards. Even I only catch a glimpse now and then. As you probably know, these magical creatures are real sharp and cautious. If they want to stay hidden, no one will find them." Kyle nodded. Kneasels were indeed highly intelligent. Newt always believed that, like Wampus cats, they had a natural talent for legilimency, although their ability didn't fit into any known category of magic. One thing was certain, you couldn't hide your true intentions from a Kneasel, as they could sense what was in your heart. Kyle's thoughts drifted to his own Kneasel, Tom, who spent most of his days eating, sleeping, and occasionally rolling onto his back in utter laziness. That one, Kyle mused, was certainly an outlier, a bit like a carefree husky in a pack of clever wolves. Back at the cabin, Hagrid enthusiastically invited Kyle in once more. "Maybe next time, Hagrid," Kyle replied, shaking his head. I need to finish some homework and get these branches ready over the holiday. He added, by the way, write to me when the dragon egg hatches. I helped care for baby dragons at Newt's once, so I have a bit of experience. That'd be wonderful. Hagrid started, then cleared his throat, trying to sound casual. I mean, of course, if you have the time. Don't worry about that. I'm sure I'll have time, Kyle said with a wave, heading back toward the castle. Hagrid watched him go before turning and heading back inside his cabin. Once he stepped in, he found Harry, Ron, and Hermione waiting anxiously. The moment they saw Hagrid, they hurried over to him, their faces full of questions. "Where's Kyle?" Harry asked. "Oh, he had other things to take care of and went back to the castle already," Hagrid replied, setting down the bow and arrows slung over his shoulder and hanging them on the wall. "I think you three should go back and work on your homework, instead of badgering me about Professor Snape. I promise you, he's definitely not planning to steal the Philosopher's Stone." But, Harry was about to argue, but Hermione cut in first. "Does what Kyle has to do have anything to do with those rowan twigs? And what about that amulet you mentioned earlier?" "Oh, that." Hagrid paused to think. "It's a little wooden carving about the size of a galleon, some kind of, passing charm. I can't quite remember the name, but it means something like that. Last year it was all the rage at Hogwarts, nearly everyone had one. Passing exams." Harry and Ron's eyes lit up, and they immediately pressed him with questions. "Does it really help people pass their exams? How much does it cost?" "You too." Hermione huffed angrily. "If you want to pass your exams, read more. Don't go relying on some amulet. And use your brains. If it really helped everyone pass, do you think Professor McGonagall would allow it at Hogwarts? That's cheating." "Maybe Professor McGonagall doesn't know," Ron retorted. Harry nodded. "Or maybe the professors don't think it's cheating. Hagrid did say it only started last year, so it's pretty new." "You, humph." Hermione snorted in exasperation, choosing to ignore them. She turned back to Hagrid. "Hagrid, do you honestly think that amulet helps people pass exams?" "Of course not," Hagrid said with a chuckle. "Even last year, there were plenty of P's, poor, D's, dreadful, and T's, troll. Hermione's right, if you want to pass, you'll have to study. It's the only way." The hopeful gleam in Harry and Ron's eyes disappeared instantly. "So Kyle was lying?" Harry asked, sounding disappointed. "Well, that's not entirely true," Hagrid replied thoughtfully. "Kyle said more than once last year that it was purely symbolic, that it didn't actually do anything." He furrowed his brow as he continued. "What's odd, though, is that even with that, loads of people still believed it worked. I remember one student saying his charms grades had always been awful, but he managed to scrape an A, acceptable, in the final exam." Hearing this, Harry and Ron's eyes brightened again, while Hermione frowned, lost in thought. The cabin fell quiet, save for the sound of Hagrid humming to himself as he stacked wood by the fireplace. If Professor Flitwick were there, he'd undoubtedly explain that the student's A had nothing to do with an amulet and was entirely due to hard work. But Flitwick wasn't here, he was likely still enjoying a butterbeer at the Three Broomsticks. On the way back to the castle, Harry and Ron were still buzzing about what they'd heard. "It helps people pass exams. By Merlin's beard, that's more valuable than the Philosopher's Stone," Harry said earnestly. "Whatever it costs, I have to get one." "Yeah. I want one, too." Ron's mood dimmed as he fished through his pocket, counting a few sickles and nuts. He muttered, "Hope it's not too expensive. I can, lend you some, or maybe you could ask Fred and George," Harry said. He'd been about to offer to buy one for Ron but quickly remembered Ron's sensitivity about money and switched gears. They were involved in that map at the start of term, so maybe they'll be in on this too. They're your brothers, so they'll probably give you a good deal. You're right, how could I forget? Ron looked up, suddenly excited. They've always been close to Kyle, and they wouldn't let their little brother fail an exam. Humph. Hermione suddenly brushed past Ron, bumping into him as she strode ahead. The two boys stopped laughing immediately, watching her hurry off. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 213, Weasley's Words of Wisdom. Back at the castle, Kyle tossed the bundle of rowan branches into the common room before disappearing into his enchanted suitcase to get back to work. In his rush, he managed to finish all his homework within just 2 days, leaving the rowan branches entirely in Cedric and the others' hands. They'd done this process the previous year, so he trusted they knew what to do. Once everyone had their tasks, Kyle seemed to vanish. He didn't show up at mealtimes, and no one could find him anywhere in the castle. The only time anyone caught sight of him was briefly in the common room before curfew, and then he'd disappear again early each morning. This pattern continued all the way until the start of the school term. At breakfast on the first day back, Cedric, noticing the dark circles under Kyle's eyes, asked curiously, "Where have you been these past few days? No one could find you anywhere in the castle." "The 8th floor." Kyle mumbled through a yawn. "There's a special room down the corridor there, just across from the troll tapestry. It turns into any room you need, and you don't have to worry about anyone finding you. I've been using it these past few days." "A room like that actually exists in the castle?" Conna exclaimed, wide-eyed. "Well, this is Hogwarts." Cedric replied thoughtfully. "I've heard of a mysterious room on the 8th floor that changes unpredictably. Some people said it turned into a fancy bedroom, while others saw it as a storage room filled with junk. It seems everyone who goes in sees something different. I even remember Fred and George talking about a broom cupboard on the 8th floor they used to hide from Filch, but when they tried to go back, it had disappeared." "That broom cupboard must be the room you're talking about, right?" "Yeah, it's called the Room of Requirement," Kyle explained, reaching for a pancake. "When Fred and George wanted to hide, the room became a broom cupboard. But if you need a place to practice magic, it'll turn into a large empty classroom." "That's incredible." Cedric's eyes lit up. "Could I go and take a look? Do you think it could turn into a Quidditch training ground so I could practice catching the golden snitch?" "I want to go too." Conna chimed in. "I've always wanted a place to practice potions where I won't be disturbed." "Sure," Kyle said. "All you have to do is walk along the corridor, mentally focusing on what you need, and pass back and forth 3 times. When you do, the door will appear." After a moment's thought, he added, "But, if someone's already inside, you won't be able to use it unless you enter the same room." Cedric's eyes gleamed with excitement, and without another word, he abandoned his breakfast and dashed off toward the 8th floor. "Aren't you going?" Kyle asked, noticing Conna sipping her pumpkin juice. "Didn't you say only one person could use it at a time?" Conna shook her head. "Let him go first. I can use the empty classrooms to practice, there's no rush. Oh, by the way." Conna suddenly remembered something. "The other day, a new Gryffindor student came looking for you quite a few times." "Gryffindor?" Kyle frowned. The trio came to mind immediately. They were the only Gryffindor first years he knew. "Yes, a girl named Hermione Granger," Conna replied slowly. "She seemed pretty upset." "You didn't tell her the Sorting Hat used the killing curse to determine her house, did you?" "Of course not. I went straight to Professor Sprout's office as soon as I got here." "I didn't even see any first years," Kyle replied. Then, glancing sideways at Conna, he muttered, "Not everyone's as gullible as you are, believing everything people say." Before he could finish, a baked potato came flying at him. Kyle caught it effortlessly, peeled off the skin, and took a bite. "So, did Hermione mention what she wanted to talk to me about?" "No," Conna replied, scowling. "But Fred and George said she's been very outspoken against your exam-passing amulet, so that's probably why she came looking for you." "Oh." Kyle nodded, understanding immediately. It was likely another one of Hagrid's slips, and with Hermione's personality, her disapproval made sense. Not that it mattered much to him, after all, he wasn't responsible for Gryffindor. Fred and George would have to deal with her concerns. After breakfast, Kyle and Connor made their way to Defense Against the Dark Arts. This term, Professor Quirrell looked even worse than before. His face was ashen and hollowed, almost cadaverous. Rumors about him being cursed by a zombie were growing more believable by the day, and students had stopped making fun of his stutter. Now, they often gave him sympathetic smiles in the halls, even Fred and George. One day, during a gathering in the Room of Requirement, Fred declared, "Imagine the courage he must have to keep teaching defense against the dark arts under a zombie curse. Quirrell's the real Gryffindor." "His bravery's thicker than that ridiculous scarf," George agreed solemnly. "And dealing with the smell of garlic every day." Cho shuddered. "If it were me, I'd have lost my mind ages ago." Cedric smirked at the twins. "Funny, considering you two were throwing snowballs at him at the beginning of the year." "We feel genuinely guilty about that," George replied, sounding unusually serious. "If Professor Quirrell's still around at the end of the school year, we'll apologize for it." "Why wait until the end of the school year?" Cho asked, puzzled. "Why not now? What if he's hiding something?" Fred shook his head. "Don't forget, he's the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. No one can guarantee he'll make it to the end of the term. Just like Professor Oren last year." George's face turned somber as he glanced at Kyle. "He was a good teacher, funny in class, friendly outside of it. I never would have guessed it was all an act. We defended him so fiercely, we even argued with Ravenclaw over him," Fred added, sighing. "Turns out it was all just a ruse. He broke our trust." As Fred and George became more emotional, they looked as though they might actually hug each other and start crying. Kyle chuckled, shaking his head. He had a feeling their admiration for Professor Oren had less to do with his personality and more with his tendency not to assign homework. Unlike Oren, who'd been lenient, Quirrell, despite looking weaker with every passing day, was meticulous with his assignments and graded with unwavering strictness. Even using larger handwriting didn't earn students any leniency. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 214, Potter's Law. The dragon egg hatched much faster than Kyle had expected. Only a few days after the Easter holidays, he received a letter from Hagrid. It contained only 2 words, "Hatching soon." The handwriting was even messier and more crooked than usual, and Kyle was certain that Hagrid hadn't taken his eyes off the dragon egg, not even while scribbling the note. The letters seemed rushed, almost jittery, nothing like Hagrid's typical scrawl. But it made sense. Raising a dragon had always been Hagrid's dream, and with the egg about to hatch, this was the moment he'd been waiting for. It was impressive enough that he even remembered to send a letter. Kyle quickly scarfed down a few bites of grilled sausage before heading over to Hagrid's hut. "You're just in time. It's about to hatch." Hagrid opened the door, his voice buzzing with excitement. "I was so nervous last night, I didn't sleep a wink." The egg, no longer by the fireplace, sat on the table, trembling occasionally with faint shakes. To Kyle's disappointment, there were no cracks visible in the egg. "Judging by how often it's shaking, it'll probably take another 2 hours before it hatches," Kyle sighed. The dragon would likely emerge around 10 a.m., right when he'd be in Transfiguration class on the 3rd floor of the castle. If only it could have been a day earlier. Yesterday morning he had herbology in the 3rd greenhouse, which was close enough to slip over during break. But today was different. Transfiguration was followed by Defense Against the Dark Arts, and Kyle didn't want to risk being late. He was still mulling this over as he made his way back to the castle. The first 3 days after a dragon hatches are the best time to bond with it. In those early days, newly hatched dragons are like sleepy newborns, their bodies still adjusting. Their aggressive instincts are dulled, and they feel a natural sense of closeness to any living creature they see. If you miss that window, getting along with them becomes much harder. "Looks like I'll need to visit Hagrid's more often over the next 3 days, Kyle thought. Of course, gifts would be essential too. Nothing fancy, just dried meat and fish, perfect treats for a Norwegian ridgeback, ideal for winning its favor. In a way, raising a dragon wasn't all that different from raising a cat. In Transfiguration, Kyle was half listening as Professor McGonagall spoke. With a casual flick of his wand, he turned the rabbit in front of him into a delicate, golden trophy, its surface glinting with polished detail. Perfectly shaped, not a hair out of place. If you'd done that a month ago, I would have given you an extra 5 points. Professor McGonagall's voice suddenly sounded close by. I understand your determination to win the competition, but I must remind you that today we're practicing transfiguring slippers. You can't go walking around with a Quidditch trophy. Sorry, Professor. Kyle flushed and quickly waved his wand, transforming the trophy into a pair of fluffy slippers with cat ears. Professor McGonagall gave a satisfied nod. Don't daydream in class next time. 3 points for Hufflepuff. As soon as noon arrived, Kyle darted out of the classroom as soon as the lesson ended, eager to get acquainted with the newborn dragon. Passing by the entrance to the Great Hall, he caught sight of Harry and Malfoy. But that didn't surprise him. As long as it wasn't during class, it seemed like Malfoy could always be found hovering near Harry, something of an unspoken rule by now. Except today, they looked a bit different. Malfoy was standing with Crabbe and Goyle, laughing loudly, an air of triumph about him. Harry, on the other hand, looked uneasy, almost guilty, as if he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. They seemed too absorbed in their standoff to notice Kyle walking by. Has Malfoy finally managed to get rid of Ron? Kyle thought, glancing curiously back at them. 10 minutes later, though, he had an idea of what was going on. So, Malfoy saw the Norwegian ridgeback too. I'm not sure, Hagrid replied, sounding a bit downcast. I only saw him leaning against the window. I didn't even notice when he came. Kyle looked over at the window Hagrid had indicated, frowning. I think Malfoy just saw something on the table. He probably didn't realize it was a dragon. Hagrid's eyes lit up. If Malfoy hadn't figured it out, maybe they wouldn't have to send Norbert away after all. It's just a guess, Kyle added. The window wasn't high, but most of it was covered by curtains, leaving only a small gap, which might have obscured a full view of the table from outside. Still, Kyle couldn't be certain. He hadn't been there at the time and had no idea where Harry and the others had been standing. But knowing Malfoy, Kyle doubted he'd miss a chance to get Harry in trouble. If he'd truly seen the dragon, he wouldn't be lingering in the Great Hall right now, he'd be heading straight to Snape's office. Kyle offered Hagrid a few more reassurances, then took out a dried fish and went over to amuse the baby dragon. True to its species, the little dragon, still small enough to fit in his hands, had remarkably sharp teeth and promptly bit the dried fish in half. Kyle, are you sure it's alright to feed it this? Hagrid asked nervously. I remember reading somewhere that it should be drinking chicken blood brandy at this stage and not eating solid food for at least a week. He reached for Dragon Breeding for Pleasure and Profit, the worn book he kept under his pillow. He'd been studying it closely. Although the book was a bit outdated, it provided a thorough guide on dragon care. What you're talking about is the standard for captive breeding, Kyle explained, pulling out another piece of dried fish. In the wild, dragons don't have chicken blood brandy on hand. For certain species, like the Norwegian ridgeback or Hungarian horntail, they're ready to eat solid food as soon as they hatch. Those sharp teeth aren't just for decoration. Really? Hagrid blinked, taken aback. But seeing Norbert happily munching on the dried fish, he decided to trust Kyle's advice. Whether it was brandy or dried fish, as long as the little dragon liked it, it should be alright. Soon, the bag of dried fish was empty, and Norbert let out a contented burp, sending a small puff of flame from his mouth. Looks like Norbert has a taste for fish, Hagrid said, beaming. Oh, by the way, I almost forgot to tell you, I named him Norbert. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 215, Ron's breakdown. Aside from his notorious difficulty keeping secrets, Hagrid's talent for naming magical creatures was hard to put into words. This time was no exception. Norbert did have a nice ring to it, but this dragon was a female. It was like calling a little girl Iron Egg. Fortunately, Norbert couldn't understand, or she might have already singed Hagrid's beard with a fiery outburst. Hagrid, I don't think that name is quite right. It's... Kyle began, but then paused as he noticed Hagrid's unusual behavior. Hagrid was covering Norbert's ears, looking at him with alarm. Don't say it, Kyle. His name is Norbert. Hagrid's voice was almost pleading. Kyle had seen this reaction before. Hagrid was thinking of his owl, Ratton, who had refused to acknowledge him after Kyle had suggested a name change. Hagrid was terrified the same thing would happen now. His name is Norbert, Hagrid repeated, clutching the dragon's head even tighter. But his hand was so large it nearly engulfed Norbert's whole head, leaving the little dragon bewildered. As soon as she realized what was happening, she began to kick her legs and flap her wings in confusion. In the end, she resorted to a burst of dragon fire, which landed on Hagrid's hand and made him wince in pain. A burnt smell filled the air, but Hagrid didn't release his grip. He simply continued to stare at Kyle with a desperate look. "All right, I won't say anything else," Kyle said, picking up on Hagrid's concern. He wisely held back any further comments, wanting to avoid getting thrown out. Norberta can stay as Norbert, he thought. She's still young and won't remember, the name can always be changed later. Hagrid, oblivious to Kyle's thoughts, finally released Norbert and hurried over to a large tub of water to plunge his hand in, sighing in relief as the burn cooled. Kyle chuckled. "You're so worried, Hagrid. She doesn't even understand names yet." Hagrid, however, changed the topic, looking slightly embarrassed. "I didn't know dragons liked fish. The book says their favorite food is sheep." The person who wrote that book probably had an Antipodean opali in mind, Kyle explained. They're native to Australia and have a taste for local sheep, and brandy, too. Of course, most dragons are like that. Sheep and cattle make up a lot of their diet. But the Norwegian ridgeback is a little different. Because of their habitat, they're the only dragons that hunt for food and water. Hagrid glanced at dragon breeding for pleasure and profit, then tossed it aside with a frustrated look. "I really should have picked a different book. This one's full of mistakes." "It's only a few parts," Kyle reassured him. "Most of the content is still useful. Or you could borrow a copy of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. There's a detailed section on the Norwegian ridgeback." Hagrid could certainly be said to dote on Norbert. In the following days, all the dead ferrets on the shelf outside his cabin disappeared, replaced by whole cow legs and carefully selected fish. And not just any fish, these were enormous, the smallest of them at least a foot long. During this time, aside from Kyle, Harry and his friends also visited frequently, though most of their time was spent inside the dim hut, trying to reason with Hagrid, urging him to send the dragon away. "You can't keep it forever, Hagrid," Hermione repeated, exasperated. "In 2 weeks, it'll be as big as the house, and you won't be able to hide it." I know, Hagrid mumbled. "But it's still so small. What if it gets bullied in the wild? I won't be able to sleep at night." Norbert looked at them, then tilted her head at Kyle, letting out a curious chirp. "Oh, they're just talking about what to have for dinner," Kyle murmured soothingly as he stroked the scales on her neck. "How about some Tebow warthog leg, with a side of corn and cabbage?" Norbert barked in displeasure and began rolling around on the floor. "No complaints. Even dragons need to eat their veggies, not just meat," Kyle insisted with a grin. Meanwhile, on the other side of the room, Hagrid was still locked in debate with Harry and the others over Norbert's future, oblivious to the playful scene unfolding nearby. "Malfoy's already noticed her," Harry warned. "It's too dangerous, Hagrid." Hagrid shook his head. But Kyle said the window was small, so Malfoy probably didn't see anything. At that, everyone turned to look at Kyle, who was sitting off to the side. "Don't look at me," Kyle said quickly. "I was just speculating." Knowing Malfoy, if he had actually seen Norbert, he would have run straight to a professor to report it. He wouldn't be sitting on that information. Or, he added thoughtfully, he might be holding on to it to blackmail Harry later. Anything's possible. You hear that, Hagrid? Harry said, raising his voice. None of us can guarantee Malfoy didn't see her. He could go to Dumbledore at any time. And it's illegal to keep a dragon, Hermione pressed. If Dumbledore finds out, he'll be so disappointed. Maybe I could keep her in the Forbidden Forest, Hagrid suggested hesitantly. Just like I did with Fluffy and Aragog at first. They're both fine now. Wait a minute. Harry said, frowning. I know Fluffy, the three-headed dog in the restricted corridor, but who's Aragog? How many creatures have you hidden in the Forbidden Forest? No, you must have heard wrong, it's just Fluffy, Hagrid stammered, though his attempt to brush it off was hardly convincing. His insistence that Aragog was a harmless little creature was met with skeptical looks all around. Harry and the others knew Hagrid far too well. With his love for creatures like the three-headed dog and the dragon, it was safe to assume any creature he adored was probably dangerous. By the way, Hagrid. Kyle interjected suddenly, placing a small bottle of blue potion on the table. This is the spider tonic you asked for. I made it extra potent, just as you requested. Even if the spider's the size of a car, it'll be effective. So, Aragog is a spider? Harry asked, looking wary. It's probably an acromantula, Hermione said thoughtfully. I read in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them that they're the only spiders that can grow as large as a car. Ron, meanwhile, said nothing. His face had gone ashen, his body stiffening as he began to tremble. The once familiar hut now felt ominous. Every shadow under the bed, every dark corner, and every cupboard seemed to harbor lurking spiders in Ron's mind. Let's go back, he stammered, looking ready to bolt. I haven't finished my homework yet. Now the fun in this clip is over. Which listeners haven't liked and commented yet? You can press like and comment to encourage the admin find the fun in the next clip. May the listeners be happy forever.